He was by far the worst serial killer in the history of Russia. What he was doing to his victims was so horrific that he was nicknamed the Satan. In this video, I will tell you full story of a serial killer, Andrei Chikatilo. Everything started in a small town Shakhty, located in Rostov region of Soviet Russia. Late 70s, early 90s was a very rough period for Soviet Union. Economy was crumbling, unemployment and low wages in Shakhty made this small town very depressive and dangerous. Most of the people there worked in the coal mines. So 22nd of December 1978, near one of the small local rivers located in a high-crime neighborhood was found a body of 9-year-old Lena Portnova. Her eyes were covered with a scarf and the body was assaulted. The victim was strangled. Her school bag was found not far away in the river. While investigators and bystanders surrounded the body, Miss Gurenkova, one of the locals, approached the detectives and told them that she saw this girl on the bus stop a couple of days ago. Gurenkova told police that Lena was standing near the bus stop with a man who was talking to her, and it looked like he was trying to persuade her to do something. The man was tall, wearing a hat and glasses. And after a short dialogue, this girl left with this man into the alley. The witness remembered this man clearly, so police was able to compose an identikit of this suspect. It looked very similar to one of the local teachers who recently bought an old house in the alley. And at the night of the murder, people saw the light in his window. Police also started checking all of the locals who were previously jailed for similar crimes. They found out that Alexander Kravchenko, who lived in the house that was closest to the river, was previously jailed for a sexual assault and the murder of an underage person. While searching his house, police found some of the neighbors' belongings in the attic. Kravchenko was arrested and soon he confessed to killing Lena Portnova. He was sentenced to execution. Everyone thought that this story was over. Not far from town Shakhty, on the river Don, is located city Rostov, capital of its own region, or as it called Oblast in Russia. Rostov is located on the right side of the river, and the left side is mostly rural. So 4th of September 1981, police got a call. Somebody saw a body on the left side of the Don River near one of the busy highways. Officers were hoping that it is, as it usually happened, a homeless person sleeping drunk. But this wasn't the case this time. Detectives soon found a naked, murdered woman. The crime scene revealed that before dying, victim fought viciously. Not far, detectives found clothes and stick that was 2 meters long, which is about 6.5 feet. Later expertise have shown that the death was caused by suffocation. Murderer strangled the victim with his bare hands. The body also was mutilated and the left nipple was cut off. Detectives didn't know that for the next 8 years, their life will be dedicated to catching a monster who will kill relentlessly, and this will become the biggest crime investigation of Soviet and Russian history. In June of 1982, in the forest near the highway, was found a body of 13-year-old Luba Karyuk. Her mother sent Luba to the neighboring village to buy groceries, and she never returned home. Then, 19-year-old Ira Korobleva, after an argument, left her home. Her body was found in the bushes 1 kilometer away from the train station. The next victim, Sergei Kuznetsov, who was 16 years old, who escaped from school because he was bullied by his classmates. His remains were found in the forest near the train tracks, not far from Shakhty. 10-year-old Luba Salomchenko went to her musical lessons and never returned home. Her body was found in the fields near town Novoshakhtinsk in Rostov region. Her heart was cut out with a knife. It seemed like the murder spree cannot be stopped. People were afraid to leave their homes. Sometimes victims had some of their body parts bitten off. In one case, the victim was suffocated because their mouth was filled with soil. All of the murders had similarities between them. Attempt of a sexual assault by the murderer, and then victims were stabbed. After it, murderer mutilated the genitals. It was obvious that it is not just a serial killer, but a sexual predator. Never in Soviet history investigators have encountered a case like this. People started calling this unknown murderer the Satan or the Rostov Ripper. In 1983, police arrested a man in a tram depot. His name was MacLeod. He right away made a statement that he and his friends killed a woman and few kids. Police officers were shocked that a serial killer who was very careful before that decided to tell everything right away. His accomplice was arrested too. After the interrogations, 3 more men were arrested. They were friends of the suspects. All 5 of them had mental disorders. Police investigators were jokingly calling this a case of idiots, and some of the officers thought that the real killer is now caught. But in September of 1983, in a forest near town Shakhty, another body was found. It was 19-year-old Vera Shevchuk. The body was mutilated and some body parts were cut off. And the killings didn't stop there. In December, a body of Sergei Martov was found. In January, Natalia Shanina, who was 18 years old at the time, was killed with 28 stab wounds. And the next victim was the oldest at the time. 45-year-old Marta Sirenka was found dead in one of the parks in Rostov city. It was obvious that 5 men who were arrested had nothing to do with previous murders. So now investigation had no suspects, no valuable clues, and they didn't even have a plan how to approach this investigation from now on. General Prosecutor's Office of Soviet Union decided to appoint the detective of high-priority cases as the head of the investigation. Issa Kostoyev was chosen for this role. He was known as uncompromising and meticulous detective. Not long before that, he successfully worked on the case of corrupt police officers. He was obviously fully aware of the murders happening in Rostov region. Issa moved to live in one of the hotels in Rostov, but he almost spent no time there. He was working around the clock to catch the Satan. His first order was to let go 5 mentally disabled people who slandered themselves. But some of the police officers still thought that they were guilty. Issa insisted that these 5 people were vulnerable and would have confessed to anything when put under pressure. But the main question was how to catch the real serial killer. Murderer either found his victims in deserted places or lured them in. Issa needed to figure out ways that will help catching the Satan. It could have been by determining his profession, appearance, and psychological profile. It was clear that the murderer often traveled using trains between Novoshakhtinsk, Shakhty, and Rostov, as most of the murders were committed in the forests close to train tracks or near the train stations. It was even possible that he worked as a railroad worker. Because some bodies were found not far from the highways, it was possible that the murderer worked as a truck driver. Most likely, killer had a job that included traveling between cities. At the end of 1985, Musa Kostoyev organized a network of undercover officers on main squares, train and bus stations in the area. They were observing, trying to find suspicious men, and approached them, trying to have a small talk. Officers who worked openly were checking documents. Every day, Issa was visiting all of the objects under police surveillance to see if the officers are on their spots. He had to do it because sometimes they just left, thinking that what they do is pointless. Female officers were also traveling on the trains disguised as homeless people, risking their lives in an attempt to attract the killer and catch him on the spot. They were covered by undercover officers, but the risk was still very high. The teenagers were also used as a bait. Police also checked blood types of 165,000 car owners in the area. While trying to catch Satan, 1,062 crime cases, including many sexual assaults, were solved, but still no sign of the most wanted serial killer. Police was so active that Rostov Ripper didn't kill anyone in 1986. He probably felt that at the time it was too dangerous. But he couldn't resist killing for too long. In 1987, Vanya Beletsky was killed with a knife. Detectives again found soil in boy's mouth. Then, in April of 1987, near the town Krasny Sulim, a body of unknown woman was found, and injuries that were inflicted left no doubt that she was also a victim of the Satan. Then, 11-year-old Alyosha Voronov went to visit his grandmother, and on the way in the forest, he stumbled upon Rostov Ripper. His body was found later with his genitals cut off. And the list of murders was increasing with horrific speed. 13-year-old Vita Petrov was with his mother on the train station and left to drink some water. His body was later found in Rostov's botanical garden, and again, no witnesses or valuable evidence. Bodies were found one after another in Rostov region, and mostly the victims were not older than 16 years old. Isak Astoev was so desperate that he even visited serial killers in Rostov prison, talking to them about the murders, hoping to understand the killer more and maybe predict his next move. Police officers and undercover agents were still patrolling all of the train stations and public areas. Agents were sent even to remote, small stations because investigators assumed that now when the killer is more cautious and police officers are everywhere, he will prefer to find victims in train stations located in rural, deserted areas. First breakthrough happened only in year 1990. Police Sergeant Igor Rybakov reported that 6th of November, when he was on the watch on the station Don Les Hoz, he saw a tall, suspicious man who just came out of the forest. He had a backpack on his shoulder. It was fitting the description of supposed murderer. He wore glasses, hat, and he was tall. Most of the people who took train from the station were collecting mushrooms in nearby forest. But backpack this man had with him didn't really fit for this purpose. He could have barely had anything else to do in the forest when it was already this cold. Rybakov followed after this man and saw him approach 3 men who were sitting near the bonfire. They were warming up after collecting mushrooms. Rybakov approached all of them and told that he works in police. Suspicious man he followed had his clothes covered with small branches. It seemed like he was just laying on the ground, and he also had a bloodstain on his cheek. This man had shown his passport, and Sergeant Rybakov had to let him go. A train approached, and at the time he had no reason to arrest him. It could have been that this man just cut himself while shaving, and maybe just fell while walking in the forest, but obviously he was still very suspicious. Official report was made about this incident. 13th of October, a body of 16-year-old boy was found near the same Don Les Hoz station. Because detectives couldn't find boy's clothes right away, they were returning in the next few days to try to locate it. And in 30-40 meters from the place where boy's body was found, which is about 100 feet, they have found a woman's body. Detectives were devastated because there was an officer on the watch on that station and he should have seen something. And when Isak Astoev was looking through the documents and reports, he saw a report of Sergeant Rybakov about suspicious man that he stopped that day. And report had the name of this man in it. It was Andrei Chikatilo. What was more surprising, it turned out that Chikatilo once was already a suspect in the murders. Years before that, in late August of 1984, a police officer who was patrolling the bus station saw a man who was just suspiciously wandering around. This man was already stopped for a checkup a couple of weeks before that. So police saw him approach a random woman. He was smiling and tried to talk to her. But this woman ignored him and left to the platform. The officer came up to her and told her that the man she talked to maybe is a murderer and asked her not to ignore him if he approaches her again, so the officers could observe his actions. Surprisingly, this woman agreed. But suspicious man didn't approach her again. Officers still decided to follow after him. He went to the train station and was wandering aimlessly there too. He saw a young woman and approached her, but was rejected again. It seemed like he had nothing else to do. Then he started wandering through town, taking buses and trolleybuses to random locations. Went to town square, always looking behind him. But luckily police officers who were following him were experienced enough not to get caught. Then this man went to one of the parks and slept for 2 hours while sitting on the bench. At night he returned to the bus station and slept there. Then detectives saw a woman who sat near this man and they started talking. Officers heard suspicious man asking this woman to meet in 1 hour at the local market. And right there at the market, this man was arrested. It was Andrei Chikatilo. Chikatilo was taken to the police station and searched. He had a piece of soap, a rope, a kitchen knife, and a small can of Vaseline in his briefcase. When he was asked why does he need a Vaseline, Chikatilo answered that he uses it as shaving cream. And rope, as he said, he used to tie the handle of his briefcase because it was tearing off. Detectives were sure that they got the killer now, but at the moment they had no reason to arrest him. They found a case that was involving embezzlement of property in the organization where Chikatilo worked, and this gave them reason to hold him in police station to win some time. But still, during the investigation, they found no evidence to prove Chikatilo's guilt, and after 3 months they had to release him. At the time, blood type tests were not as advanced as they are today, and because of it, in 1984, Chikatilo was not arrested and continued his murder spree for years. For some time after release, Chikatilo was under surveillance, but he probably was understanding it and laid low for a while. So in 1990, Isak Astoev, after finding Sergeant Rybakov's report and getting information about the events of 1984, decided to arrest Chikatilo. 20th of November 1990, Chikatilo returned from his work earlier than usual. His wife wasn't home. He aimlessly wandered through his apartment. Then he ate something, took an empty 3-liter jar, and left to buy beer. Because of crumbling economy, beer was not easy to find in stores, and Chikatilo had to go pretty far to buy it. So Chikatilo bought some beer, and when he was leaving the store, detectives approached him, asked his name, and after he named himself, Andrei Chikatilo was finally arrested. So who actually was this man? He was born in 1936 and lived on the surface a normal life of a Soviet citizen with his wife and 2 kids. He was growing up during Second World War and after famine in Ukrainian Republic, while his father fought the war. Chikatilo had to take care of his brother while his mother was desperately trying to feed the family. He supposedly saw a mass execution committed by German troops, and at some point he spent a night in a big pile of bodies, hoping not to be noticed by them. Chikatilo's older brother, as mother later told him, was abducted and eaten by their neighbors, who went insane because of the starvation. Growing up with health issues and traumatized made Chikatilo shy and fearful. He was constantly bullied in school and later in the army. In the village where he lived at the time, one of his girlfriends told everyone that he is sexually impotent after she went on the date with Chikatilo. Now everyone there, and mostly young females, were bullying him because of that fact. After the army, Chikatilo decided to change his life and moved to live in Rostov region. There he got married and had 2 kids with his wife, who he loved dearly. He was working in the newspaper and later in one of the schools as a teacher, but then he was fired for harassing one of the female students. His relations with his colleagues or superiors were always tense. While killing and dismembering innocent people, in his free time Chikatilo was constantly writing complaints on his colleagues when he felt that they mistreat him. So let's return to the day of the arrest. Right on the first interrogation, detectives saw that Chikatilo's finger was seriously bitten. He didn't visit a doctor to show it. His last victim was a tall 16-year-old boy, so he probably have put up a fight before he was killed. Astoev was preparing for the first interrogation. He was waiting for this moment for 8 years. At the time, he didn't have any solid evidence against the Rostov Satan, so they had only 10 days to make Chikatilo talk. After 10 days, by the Soviet laws, he had to let him go, if he could present no evidence to the court. Astoev decided to give Chikatilo hope. If he will be recognized as insane, he will not be executed. And Chikatilo, as he was very afraid of death, started talking. He said that his first murder he committed in 1978, but detectives didn't know that he had anything to do with this murder, because another man was executed for it. Andrei Chikatilo was that teacher who lived near the river and was a first suspect in the murder of Lena Portnova. If back then, in 1978, he would have been arrested and charged, more than 50 lives would have been saved. But because Alexander Kravchenko, who was an easy suspect, was arrested and executed for this murder, Chikatilo was able to kill dozens of people for more than 10 years. Detectives now had not only Chikatilo's confession as a proof, but he also have shown a body of 10-year-old Lyosha Sobolev, who was considered missing before that day. Chikatilo just buried boy's body in one of the cemeteries. Before that, police had no information about this murder. After this moment, Chikatilo had no chance to retract his testimony and say that he confessed to everything under pressure. Investigation continued for 2 years. Chikatilo was taking detectives to all of the crime scenes and was showing his outstanding memory, remembering smallest details of the murders. He was calmly showing on the mannequins how he was stabbing his victims. Chikatilo was always very aroused when his victims resisted him, and when they were screaming in terror, he was enjoying it even more. After he was able to avoid arrest in 1984, Chikatilo was so sure that he won't be arrested that he started approaching kids in broad daylight, asking them to go with him. 16-year-old Natasha Golasovskaya he met on the bus station. She was irritated that bus didn't arrive for some time. Chikatilo said that he knows another bus route and offered her to go with him. He was very polite, also wearing gray suit and a tie, and when they were in the deserted forest, he killed her with a knife. When returning home, he just put his knife under the drawer where he had more than 30 of them. Then he was just drinking tea and reading newspapers like nothing happened. Chikatilo was often cutting some body parts of his victims, like a piece of tongue or a nipple, and sometimes took them with him. In some occasions, he just ate a piece right there on the murder scene. When he was traveling elsewhere, Chikatilo was taking a pot with him, as his wife remembered. He was using it to cook body parts of his victims he was taking from the murder scenes. Then the trial started. Chikatilo was constantly complaining, remembering his hungry childhood, telling that his younger brother was eaten, and that everyone were hostile to him, including neighbors, colleagues, and superiors. Then Chikatilo very obviously started pretending that he's crazy, in desperate attempt to save his life. But while he was in his cell, he behaved very differently, reading newspapers, eating with great appetite, or playing chess with his cellmates. During the trial, court security was having a hard time trying to protect Chikatilo from his victims' relatives who were ready to tear him apart. 15th of October 1992, Andrei Chikatilo was sentenced to execution for 52 murders. 4 more murders were never proven, and 14th of February 1994, after 2 years of complaints and multiple pleas to the president asking to pardon him, Chikatilo was executed by a shot in his head in the basement of one of the prisons.